I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, joined now by San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Liz, great to have you here on the show. The last defendant in the shooting death of a San Antonio police officer after a high-speed chase that went through 3 different counties has now been sentenced, closing the book on the killing of San Antonio police officer Robert Deckard. So tell me about this latest development.
Yes, this was a case that was just, all of these cases that involve, the killing of police officers are always extremely tragic and very sad. But this particular case involving Officer Robert Deckard was one that started because he was patrolling in the southern part of Bexar County. It was winter. It was like in December of 2013. And he had gotten a report that there had been an armed robbery. And there were 2 people that had been on this robbery spree that had gone on for about 2 weeks. And they happened to come into contact with Officer Deckard, and they got involved in this chase that reached speeds of about 115 miles per hour as the vehicle snaked through South Bexar County into Wilson County and finally in Atascosa County, where Officer Deckard was shot by Sean Puente. And that was on December 8th of 2013. And 13 days later, Officer Deckard died from a single gunshot wound that hit him in the forehead.
And so now this week, the getaway driver, Genevieve Ramos, had her day in court. What happened with that sentencing?
Yes, Chance, the Atascosa County District Attorney, who is Audrey Lewis, told me this week that as they were preparing to bring jurors in for selection to be on the panel, Genevieve Ramos decided to plead guilty to murder for her part in the death of Officer Deckard. Now, she had been charged, along with her boyfriend, Sean Puente, with capital murder of a police officer. And incidentally, Sean Puente last year was tried and convicted of this. Now, the jury convicted him, but they ended up deadlocking in the punishment phase on whether or not to send him to death row. And in those situations, because capital offenses are either punishable by death or life in prison without the possibility of parole, he was automatically sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. So this week, Genevieve Ramos did plead guilty not only to murder for her part in the death of Officer Deckard, but also to attempted capital murder for shooting at a police officer in Wilson County during this chase. And then we were talking earlier about the robberies that had occurred in San Antonio. Part of that plea also included 4 armed robberies in San Antonio. And, those were the reason that the chase began in the first place.
And so it's a little bit more complicated than just saying a life sentence. It turns out Ramos has 2 life sentences, correct? How is that going to be served?
Well, yeah, the 2 life sentences for Genevieve Ramos, for her admitting her responsibility in all of the cases that we mentioned, are going to be served at the same time. She pleaded to a lesser charge of murder. So that does give her the possibility of becoming eligible for parole. But she's going to have to serve at least 30 years before she is eligible, and eligibility is not certain. This is much better than what she would have gotten had had obviously, if they would have gone, to trial on the capital murder charges, she could have faced many more years. And also, if the prosecutors would have decided, to do something like maybe uh, go for the judge, to ask the judge to stack, you know, the sentences, she would have had a lot longer. But 30 years, 30 years is a long time, and that kind of goes to what's been explained to me by attorneys, that a life sentence is kind of considered to be 60 years. So when you think about a life sentence as about 60 years, you do have to serve at least half of that time. But it is still half of someone's lifetime.
Something that I remember of when we were discussing this trial on another previous episode of the docket, was that there was a bit of a difficulty because this trial did not take place in Bexar County, but of course it involved people and places that are in Bexar County. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes, it was. Everything kind of started in San Antonio with these particular robberies, and it was really, there were some really, I guess, dramatic specifics about how this whole thing went down. Um, they were they were driving a Mitsubishi Lancer, the getaway car that Ramos was driving, and her then boyfriend Sean Puente was repeatedly firing a pistol out of the back window of the car, and he shot. I want to say he shot probably about close to 30 shots out of the back of the car as they were driving down the road. And again, they were reaching speeds in excess of 115 miles per hour. But only one of the 36 rounds that Puente fired at Officer Deckard hit him, but it hit him in the forehead, which caused him to lose control of his police cruiser, which was a Chevrolet Tahoe SUV, and then he ran into a tree off of Interstate 37. So it began in San Antonio, and it snaked through Wilson County and then into Atascosa. And because it happened there, because this is where the crime occurred, that is where the trial occurred as well. Now there were, I covered at least one of those days in Atascosa County with my colleague Bruce Selcraig. So, but in the courtroom there were people that were showing up from San Antonio, and obviously Officer Deckard's relatives and others who just wanted to see how things were going to go down. And there also was a little bit of a drama about jury selection in the county that my colleague Bruce had covered, that there had been I believe it was an email or a discussion that had occurred between the district attorney's office and others about finding people who were willing to sit on a jury and consider the death penalty. We wrote about that. It was a situation where I guess people could have questioned whether or not it was ethical to do, but in these particular instances where you have a situation like this where a police officer is shot, and Ramos and Puente were dressed all in black. They were even wearing bulletproof vests. I mean, it is very, very obvious that they had been doing something. I mean, people, normal people don't do that. I mean, you don't walk around with a bulletproof vest and all dressed in black. I mean, and, armed. So, there was just a lot of different elements to this particular case that was just very tragic.
And of course, the most tragic thing about this specific case would be the officer who lost his life. By all accounts, Officer Deckard, really a beloved man, husband and father. I believe he left this world with a wife and two children. He was a 7-year veteran of the police force. So, what was the reaction to this sentence for the final person involved in his death?
Yes, after they did not get the death penalty for Sean Fuente, the family of Robert Deckard's family just didn't want to go through that again. And this is something that San Antonio Police Chief William McManus told me this week, because the family went through, I believe this trial lasted almost 4 months. And it's just a very, very grueling thing to go through. I've seen victims in court cases, and it's been very difficult for them, to hear all of the things that happen to their loved ones. There's photographs that are shown, there's testimony from witnesses. Um, Sometimes there's testimonies from, participants, people who, actually you wonder whether or not they should have been charged. So it's a very, very hard thing for them. And when I spoke to Chief McManus, he said that although the the plea and the sentence for Genevieve Ramos can bring some closure to the family, and in some cases, and to I'll say to Chief McManus as well, and to his department, um, there's also a sense of injustice whenever anybody, and this is actually, I'm going to go ahead and just say the quote that Chief McManus gave. He said he he said, I think it brings closure as much as it can for the family. But there is a sense of injustice whenever anyone can escape the death penalty after killing a police officer. And Chief McManus is, of course, very adamant about that. He believes that anybody who kills a police officer should face and get the death penalty. And so when we were talking about this, he had been in contact with a member of the Deckard family. And I tried to get a hold of them as well, but I could not reach them. So I was glad when I spoke with Chief McManus and he said that he had been in contact with them, and that just the thought of going through another trial like that was just a little too much. And they just really didn't want to have to endure that again. So, you know, Chief McManus said that I believe he was speaking with an uncle of the family. He said that they were, going to be able to move on from this, as best as they can. But and I've heard other people say similar things as well. That as long as, like in this particular case, it's going to be a long time before Genevieve Ramos is going to be eligible for parole, and that has to give them some sort of comfort or satisfaction. And Sean Puente is never going to get out of prison. So, for them, uh, this this is this is probably they know that this is the best that they could do, and even though it is justice, there's a little sense of injustice to it, if that makes sense. But as far as Officer Deckard, whom relatives and people who worked with him, affectionately, they called him Bobby, across the board. And I've seen photographs of Officer Deckard, and he just kind of has this smile. He had this smile that just kind of would light up a room. And, even the Atascosa County District Attorney, Audrey Lewis, when I spoke to her, she talked about what a good man and a great officer Bobby Deckard was. And when we talked about the specifics of the case and also, whether or not the family was okay with this plea agreement, she also, reiterated and echoed what Chief McManus had said, and that this family had gone through 4 months of a trial with Sean Puente, and it was painful and it caused a lot of stress. But she said in the end, when they worked with people in Bexar County, because remember, we had those armed robbery cases out of San Antonio. So you had the Bexar County District Attorney's Office working with Atascosa County. And also, one of those charges that we talked about, the attempted capital murder of a POS police officer who was shot at during this chase, you've got Wilson County in there also, because POS is in Wilson County. So you had a lot of different agencies, working together to try to get, justice for the Deckard family. So, again, a very, very, very tragic and sad case that that ended, with this latest sentencing of Genevieve Ramos, who was going to be in Wilson County's jail until they transferred her to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, which should be happening probably by the end of this week. For the family, there's a little bit of closure. There's some justice, but your hearts kind of go out to them because of the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice that Officer Robert Deckard made.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.